Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 15th chapter in the book of Genesis. Here we witness an example of Yahweh speaking through visions. Now, Yahweh speaks to us in many ways, and the contents of his speech in the vision, Yahweh is an invisible entity, we have to remember. So Abraham didn't, strictly speaking, behold him in form, because there's no form to behold. But the event we are indebted to Moses for recording, dictated through the Ruach Kadesh, so we can be assured of its accuracy. Although it takes place over 500 years after its occurrence, it's as valid as history, because prophecy is more reliable than history in that its source springs from an omniscient deity. So the opening verse reads, "After these events, the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward is exceedingly great.'" Now, right off the bat, I recognize an error. I earlier referred to him as Abraham. That's what he's known to posterity as. But for the better part of his life, he was known as Abram. It's not until the 17th chapter that he receives the name Abraham. And the events he's referring to in the 14th chapter, we witness Abraham emerge victorious over a coalition of 5 kings, which he was allied with on the victorious side. So he had cause to be afraid for the vengeance that they were seeking, but he assures him that he's his shield. In other words, he serves as a protective function from harm, be it temporal or spiritual, and his reward is exceedingly great. So he has a lot to look forward to that a lot in his maybe current situation doesn't suggest. And Abram said, "Master Yahweh, what would you give me, seeing I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus?" So Abraham's not thinking of the past. The kings were the previous event referred to in the previous chapter. He's mindful of the future, and his great concern is that he's an elderly man with an elderly wife who are both his wife is past the childbearing age. And so he has a concern of who he's going to leave his progeny to. Now, according to the contemporaneous legal protocol, the inheritance fell to the eldest or most trusted servant in one's household, and that position was occupied by Eleazar of Damascus. And though Abraham loved him, he really, really longed for a son. And Abram said, "See, you have given me no seed, and see, one born in my house is my heir." So God's delays are not God's denials. He originally, when he called Abraham out of idolatry and paganism from the land of Ur to a unique relationship with him, he assured him that through him he would sire a nation through whom all the nations of the world would be blessed. We read of that in the first 3 verses of the 12th chapter. And he's almost questioning why don't I have any heirs at this point? And it's a common concern for people in that stage of life in his particular situation, we can imagine. "And see, the word of Yahweh came to him, saying, 'This one is not your heir, but he who comes from your own body is your heir.'" So the servant is someone else's child. Someone else sired and mothered him, and he's attached to his house, but he's not, strictly speaking, part of his family, and he's certainly not from his loins. So he's assuring him that his heir and his progeny would come through a son, and not just a son, but a son by his wife, because remember, Abraham's wife eventually encourages him to, in the next chapter, to impregnate her servant girl Hagar, who was an Egyptian, and through him the son of Ishmael is born. But more specifically, we read that he's to be the seed of promise is to be invested in the son of Isaac, who comes through his wife, who is well past the childbearing age at this point. I believe he was 75 when he was called out of Ur, and he was 100 or around 100 or 99 when he bare the child age, and his wife is approximately in the same territory. "And he brought him outside and said, 'Look now towards the heavens, and count the stars if you are able to count them.' And he said to him, 'So are your seed.' Now, in order to grasp what he grasped, we'd have to remove ourselves from the city, because one of the facts of the modern world is that collectively the light pollution from the electricity we generate in our modern cities blocks much of what the stars which are in the sky. So I want you to imagine yourself in a distant country place and beholding a sky full of stars, and he's alternately promised in other locations descendants as numerous as the sand on the seashores. So whether he looked above him or below him, he would have a constant reminder that through him would be a nation of this many people. And he believed in Yahweh, and he was reckoned righteous for his faith. And now the ethical properties of faith are disputed by skeptics, the idea being that one who is skeptical is not necessarily ethically impaired, but the measure and worth of faith is on the object in which it rests. And faith in Yahweh can do no wrong, because he is perfect, and he is loving, and he is generous, and he is giving. So we owe it to ourselves to understand the specific faith that he's talking about. And the idea of righteousness being embodied in faith acquires new momentum in the New Testament, the new dispensation, from a verse in Habakkuk, who is one of the prophets. I did Habakkuk 2, Corey Johnston. You can type in more on that for more on that, but we're going to return to the chapter at hand. And he said to him, I am Yahweh, who brought you out of Kasdim, to give you this land to inherit it. Now, Abram was originally an Aramaean wanderer, a nomad of sorts, but the settled nation which was to spring from his loins, were to be located in what corresponds to the modern nation of Israel, and the borders are alluded to throughout Scripture. I don't think the nation of Israel has yet to claim the fullness of the territory promised to Abram. And he said, Master Yahweh, whereby do I know that I possess it? So he's clearly in his nomadic stage. He doesn't have a sense of home or stability, as let alone a nation or a country. And so he's asking, how is this to be? It's not an expression of doubt. It's more a request for an explanation. And he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, and a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he took all these to him, and cut them in the middle, and placed each half opposite of the other. But he did not cut the birds. So that he was performing an animal sacrifice, and in the Mosaic covenant, the substitutionary sacrifice for sin would be of central significance in the ceremonial spiritual life of the ancient Israelites. And the birds of prey came down on the carcass, and Abram drove them away. So Yahweh, perhaps initially unbeknownst to Abram, is that he's using the event in the chain of sequence therein to illustrate a spiritually significant truth. And we're going to find out what that is. And it came to be, when the sun was going down, and a deep sleep fell upon Abram, that a frightening great darkness fell upon him. So he communicates to us in our consciousness, when our waking hours, and alternately in our dreams. This is a frequently repeated experience of communication from God to man throughout the Old Testament. But initially he succumbed in great darkness, so I want you to imagine being in outer space without any source of light and seemingly surrounded by darkness. And he said to Abram, know for certain that your seed are to be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them for 400 years. So this alludes to, in advance, the Exodus experience, whereby a grandson by the name of Abram is, long story short, sold into slavery by his jealous other brothers, because he was the unique recipient of their father Jacob's love. And in Egypt, he ascends to the prime minister position, and then a pharaoh came who knew not Jacob, and Joseph in Exodus 1:7, and he eventually enslaves them for a period of 400 years. So he's letting him know in advance that not everything in their path to this promise is going to be a bag of roses, and it's often but it's all for a purpose. But the nation whom they serve I am going to judge, and afterward let them come out with great possessions. We read in the Exodus account that the escaped Israelite slaves left with bounty and many gold and silver items from the land which enslaved them. Now as for you, you are going to go to your fathers in peace. You are to be buried at a good old age. So he's promising him long life, and I believe Abraham lived to 150, if not 175 years in length, and this is exceptional by the standards of the time, because the pre-Diluvian or flood era people lived substantially longer. The record is 969 years, held by Methuselah. You can read the length of ages of the righteous remnant sprang through Seth's loins all the way up to Noah in the 5th chapter of Genesis. But after the Diluvian or flood period, the lives rarely exceed 120 years. So Abraham was, in fact, blessed for that. Then in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the wickedness of the Amorites is not yet complete. The Amorites were one of the nations within the promised land of Canaan, the principal nation being Canaan, so named after a grandson of Noah, sprang through Ham's loins. And he gave them plenty of time to repent, but he knew in advance that they were going to be wicked, and the Israelites had the role of displacing them as a judgment upon them for their wickedness. And it came to be, when the sun went down and it was dark, that see a smoking oven and a burning torch passing between those pieces. On the same day Yahweh made a covenant with Abram, saying, I have given this land to your seed, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Para. So these are the dimensional boundaries of what is to become the promised land, which was initially promised to Abraham, who was a sojourner, we remember in the 13th verse, which was a wandering nomad. Now, in this historical time period, there were settled civilizations of stationary agricultural people, and there were also nomads who lived on the periphery of civilization. Abraham was learned and educated, but so he left civilization to travel as a nomad, but through him a great civilization would spring. With the Canaanites and the Kezanites and the Quadramites and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Raphaim and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Girgashite and the Jebusite. So this is the list of the nations currently occupying, who would occupy the promised land until they were settled there and established during the time of Joshua, who was Moses' successor. But these lands were full of people giving idolaters and pagans, who Israel was commanded to, in some cases, exterminate them completely, because their spiritual contaminating influences could not inhabit the same land. And now all of these nations respectively carry unique civilization factors, and not all of them worshipped the exact same gods, but they were all invariably pagan idolaters. But it is the Raphaim alluded to, the final of 3 in verse 20, beginning with Hittite, to whom what is known as the Star of David is in fact originated in. So the traditional symbol of Judaism is in fact rooted in paganism, and that's an error that they haven't addressed or redressed, but it's ultimately something to bear in mind. And that concludes today's lesson. Thank you so much for tuning in. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.